Now that's what I'm gawking about. Yep, it's more TV Boy on NES Works Gaiden episode 57. By contrast to Excite Invader, the TV Boy's second release, or at least second catalog entry, does have novelty working in its favor. It's another clone title, but it's a clone of a game that Japanese publishers and developers almost never ripped off in the early 80s, Activision's Kaboom. By that measure, Mr. Bomb feels far fresher and more contemporary than Excite Invader. Its reference material hailed from 1981 rather than 1978, and again, you simply didn't see Kaboom-alikes on Japanese standalone consoles the way you did Invader's wannabes. Of course, Kaboom ultimately amounted to Breakout in reverse, so it's not like the design language of Mr. Bomb would have been entirely unfamiliar to anyone in the market for a TV Boy. Breakout had been a huge hit in Japan, and Taito had specifically iterated on it to create Space Invaders. Designed by Larry Kaplan and programmed by David Crane, yeah, that guy again, Kaboom added its own unique personality to the Invaders' Breakout concept by pitting the player's avatar, a bucket of water, against a single foe, the Mad Bomber, who lurked at the top of the screen dropping bombs. Kaboom effectively reverted the Invaders' concept back toward the Breakout space by forcing players to collect, rather than avoid, the bomber's deadly missiles. The bomber would drop strings of bombs in rapid succession, and the player needed to avoid missing bombs for high score. If a single bomb slipped past and hit the bottom of the screen, it would detonate and cause the player to lose one of their buckets. Kaplan created Kaboom as a legally distinct version of Atari's Avalanche, though Activision's magic touch meant that Kaboom has become the more iconic work. Mr. Bomb borrows Kaboom's borrowed gameplay concept in turn. Players move a gigantic water glass rather than a wide bucket paddle, and the Mad Bomber inexplicably becomes a Frankenstein's monster. But the premise remains identical. You need to catch all the bombs before they hit the bottom of the screen. However, Mr. Bomb does incorporate one new mechanic to the Kaboom Avalanche formula, a limited water supply. It's no longer simply enough to catch the falling bombs in your oversized drinking glass here. You need to be sure that you have sufficient water in your reservoir to douse their fuses. Every time a bomb lands in your glass, it reduces your supply of water, a mechanic vaguely reminiscent of Jaleco's Guzzler, released around the same time as Mr. Bomb for Othello Multivision. If a bomb lands in a dry glass, it's the same as if that bomb had fallen astray, and you lose a life. In order to avoid keeping your powder dry, you need to top off your water supply at the tap on the left side of the screen. Ducking under the tap will cause the cup's water level to rise, preventing the inevitable grip of death. Mr. Bomb never really slows the pace of his bombardment, and he slides back and forth across the top of the screen to unleash his payload from all over the place. While it's easy enough to refill your reservoir while he's bombing near the tap, the task of snagging a refill while he attacks at the right side of the screen seems downright impossible, especially since the TV Boy limits you to simple digital controls rather than using Kaboom's zippy analog rotary controller. Impossible, that is, until you realize that you can tap the A button to briefly arrest his attacks. This turns a hopeless game into a manageable one, though still challenging. Even after you master the timing of hitting pause to top off your tank, you still need to be mindful of the nature of Mr. Bomb's projectiles. The blue bombs that he drops are interspersed with blue rocks that look identical to the explosives but for the fact that they lack a lighted fuse. These might appear to be simple dud bombs that pose no threat, since they don't explode when you let them pass, but in fact that is not true. Rocks do present a hazard, but only if you attempt to catch them. Let a rock hit your paddle avatar and it will crack the bottom of the glass, which causes water to drain away rapidly. This reduces the number of bombs you can catch per recharge, meaning that you need to refill the glass far more frequently. Mastering the timing of this action is crucial to being able to pass the first 3 or 4 stages. But it's a short-lived victory, because no matter how well you play, eventually the game takes away half the height of your reservoir, leaving you with only half as much water with which to catch bombs that fall with greater frequency. Mr. Bomb also likes to drop rocks immediately following a bomb, making it very difficult to catch a bomb without also cracking your glass. It's a challenging game and one that's not meant to be played beyond 6 or 7 rounds. The water and rock mechanics take a little bit of practice to master, but on the whole, they do add something fresh and interesting to the Kaboom formula. I wouldn't say Mr. Bomb is necessarily a timeless work, but it does at least establish Gakken's uncredited game programmers as possessing a desire to put their own twist on others' work, akin to that of the unknowns behind Epoch's Super Cassette Vision library. We move on to the third of Gakken TV Boy's 6 games, and wouldn't you know it, it's another thinly veiled ripoff of a popular arcade game by someone else. But as with Mr. Bomb, Robotan Wars looks for inspiration to a Western release that other Japanese developers rarely, if ever, imitated. You don't have to think too hard to figure out where Gakken's programmers looked for this reference material, since it's more or less right there in the name. Robotan Wars takes its cues from Robotron 2084, the innovative twin-stick arcade shooter designed by Eugene Jarvis and manufactured by Williams. Robotron's subtitle riffed on George Orwell's 1984, of course, though the actual premise of the game had nothing to do with that novel. Rather than telling a tale of societal repression by a fascistic government by way of media programming and government-mandated groupthink, Robotron simply dropped the player into an arena populated by killer androids and asked them to protect a handful of civilians from the roaming robo-hordes. While the robots grossly outnumbered the hero in his charges, the player did have the unique advantage of independent movement and firing capabilities. With the arcade unit's left stick dedicated to movement, and the right stick dedicated to directing gun attacks, the Robotron machine allowed players to evade enemy attacks while blasting away in a completely different direction, resulting in some of the fastest and most challenging gameplay ever seen in arcades to that point. The TV Boy, of course, lacked the inputs necessary to support that style of gameplay. With a single 4-directional lever, Gakken's console wasn't precisely built with Robotron fanatics in mind. But I'd say the console acquits itself reasonably well. Converting Robotron to consoles was a perpetual challenge in the olden days, and even the mighty GCC didn't quite stick the landing on the vastly more capable Atari 7800. Gakken did about as well as you could reasonably expect. The loss of dual sticks certainly hurts, especially due to the decision not to allow your on-screen avatar to continue firing in the most recent direction you moved them in. While standing neutral, you simply can't fire. Rather, you can only shoot while moving, which does change the nature of the game a fair amount. Robotron 2084 thrived on the blistering speed that resulted from independent movement and attack controls. Players could focus on evasion and survival while blasting at enemies all around them, creating a constant sensation of movement and allowing the CPU to absolutely swarm the hero with deadly foes. That doesn't happen here, really. It can't. Not only does the TV Boy's interface make that approach impossible, so does the console's underlying tech. Honestly, I'm impressed that Robotan Wars manages to get as much moving around the screen at once as it does. But by linking movement and attack, the game forces players to approach the action in a specific way. You tend to move in sweeping arcs, maneuvering into open spaces, and attempting to lead enemies toward you while putting enough distance between yourself and your pursuers so that you can double back and fire at them. This becomes more difficult in later stages, where the bad guys gain new abilities and take a more aggressive stance, quickly chasing your avatar and unleashing beams of energy at you. You also need to be mindful of the civilians who appear around the screen. As in Robotron, you need to collect these innocents in order to protect them, while the bad guys will usually kill them on contact. Some enemies will instead absorb a citizen, transforming into a powered-up cyborg that pursues you relentlessly, a feature adopted from Robotron, but which comes into play much sooner in the mix here. Given the TV Boy's limitations, it's a pretty impressive attempt to swipe the arcade hit. By and large, Robotan Wars is much easier than Robotron 2084. It moves more slowly, the screen can't contain as many bad guys, and the humans caught in the crossfire don't seem to be quite so vulnerable. But the meager capabilities of the system do affect the gameplay as you advance into later stages. There's just not as much room for the mix of threats in Robotan Wars to expand, meaning that the difficulty level doesn't grow all that much from the beginning through to the end. It also doesn't help that each level appears to begin in more or less the same state each time you play, with enemies and innocents alike always appearing to spawn in the same spots. The more you play, the more opportunities you have to memorize each stage's layouts and concoct strategies. It's about as good a take on Robotron 2084 as you can expect on a system like this, so as long as you set your expectations low enough, it's probably about as good a Robotron adaptation as you saw on any early 80s console. I've talked a lot about Konami's Scramble, a formative game that we've yet to see a licensed home release for on this channel. But Gakken brings us the next best thing, or rather, the worst version of the next best thing. For some weird reason, Gakken adapted and published Konami's Super Cobra under the name Chitaikuu Daisakusen, roughly the Great Surface-to-Air Adventure. As far as I can tell, this was a legitimate, licensed port. The packaging and software both cite a Konami copyright. Needless retitling aside, everything about this game conveys a strong sense of, being Super Cobra, which itself probably should have been called Super Scramble. If not for the change of player sprite from a fighter to a helicopter, Super Cobra basically amounts to an amped-up version of the earlier game. It contains nearly twice as many different environmental scenarios, referred to some sources as levels, despite the lack of a hard delineation beyond a sudden palette change between areas. Super Cobra also ramps up its difficulty more quickly than Scramble, hitting players with more aggressive aerial threats and narrower environments to navigate right from. However, the player's capabilities didn't really change in this follow-up, despite the shift in vehicle from starfighter to combat chopper. Like the Scramble ship, the chopper can rise and descend, fire straight ahead, and drop air-to-ground bombs in a lazy arc. These bombs play a crucial role in clearing out terrestrial objects. Some of those objects consist of surface-to-air missiles, whose launches are triggered by proximity in such a way that they will hit the chopper unless you evade or destroy them. Other ground emplacements pose no danger at all unless you fail to blow them up. These objects, fuel tanks, exist simply to allow the player to replenish the chopper's gas tank. That's in Zaxxon and Zoom 909 and Scramble and several other games we've seen on this channel. Detonating a fuel tank mysteriously causes its fuel to transfer into the player's oil tank, allowing your fighter to fly a little longer. So Super Cobra presents players with a straightforward, but nevertheless involving set of challenges along a few different axes. You need to evade enemies and projectiles, avoid smashing into the scenery, and take care to nuke fuel depots as you're able. Run out of gas, or run into an obstacle and your not-so-super helicopter explodes instantly. Fragile thing that it is. Gakken's adaptation of this game is functional. It's a fair bit smoother than Epoch's Scramble clone Astro Command for CassetteVision, but considering that game was pushing at the boundaries of a device designed for playing Pong and Space Invaders, I'd still give Astro Command the edge, simply for being a case of, dear God, how do they do that? Chitaikuu Daisakusen features the same nasty, minimal color palette as every other game on this system, with pitiful sound effects and rudimentary visuals. But we all know that a TV Boy game could never set any records for audiovisual fidelity, so these things are really just a given. The real question is, how does it play? I think the term you're looking for here is acceptably. It's not amazing or even good, but aside from some choppiness due to low resolution and the system's poor scrolling support, the game responds well and performs all the functions you'd expect. Honestly, as externally developed licensed 8-bit adaptations of Konami arcade games go, I'd still rather play Chitaikuu Daisakusen over the Konami disasters that appeared on SG-1000. Super Cobra Incognito still beats Hyper Olympic any day of the week. A low parallel bar to clear, but I'll take it. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, TV Boy may not have been great, but at least it didn't overstay its welcome.